In the gleaming glass towers of Richardson and Associates, a Fortune 500 company in downtown Chicago, Mrs. Rose Washington moved silently through the corridors each evening, pushing her cleaning cart with practiced efficiency. At 45, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her hair neatly tied back, and her uniform always crisp despite the nature of her work. What none of the suited executives knew was that she held 2 degrees, one in business administration and another in corporate finance. The night shift suited Rose perfectly. During the day, she attended online classes, working towards her master's degree while caring for her teenage daughter. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago, leaving them with mounting medical bills, forcing Rose to take whatever work she could find. But she never complained, viewing each moment as an opportunity to learn and grow. As she cleaned the executive floor that evening, she couldn't help but overhear a conversation from the boardroom. The company was facing a major crisis, their financial reports showed concerning discrepancies, and their biggest client was threatening to pull out. The CEO, Mr. Thompson, was more interested in planning his next golf trip than addressing the situation. "Just hide the numbers in the subsidiary accounts," he told the CFO dismissively. "Nobody looks at those anyway." Rose's hand tightened on her mop handle. After 20 years in the cleaning industry, she had learned that being invisible had its advantages. People spoke freely around her, never considering that the woman quietly emptying their trash bins might understand every word of their financial jargon. Over the next few weeks, Rose began documenting everything she observed. Her financial background helped her piece together a complex puzzle of corporate fraud and mismanagement. She noticed how the company was systematically overcharging clients while underpaying their workers, particularly those in maintenance and cleaning services. One evening, as Rose was cleaning Mr. Thompson's office, she witnessed him berating a young janitor for accidentally bumping into his desk. "You people need to learn your place," he sneered, not even bothering to look the young man in the eye. "This is why you'll never be anything more than a cleaner." Something snapped inside Rose that day. She had endured similar treatment, stayed silent through countless microaggressions, and watched others suffer the same indignities. But now, armed with evidence of corporate wrongdoing and her deep understanding of finance, she knew it was time to act. She spent her lunch breaks in the company library, researching whistleblower protocols and corporate governance. Rose meticulously organized her findings, creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked the fraudulent activities. She knew she had to be careful. One wrong move could not only cost her job but potentially make it impossible for her to find another one. The turning point came when she discovered emails showing that Mr. Thompson had been diverting company funds into personal offshore accounts. This wasn't just about corporate greed anymore, it was outright theft. Rose realized she held in her hands the power to change not just her own situation, but the lives of every employee who had been treated as invisible. With trembling hands but unwavering resolve, she drafted an email to the company's board of directors and the SEC. Her message was clear, professional, and backed by irrefutable evidence. She included a detailed analysis of the financial discrepancies, witness statements from other employees, and recordings of questionable board meetings she had overheard. As she hit send, Rose whispered a prayer, not for revenge, but for justice. Little did the executives know that their greatest reckoning would come from the very person they had deemed insignificant. The quiet cleaning lady was about to shake the very foundation of their corporate empire, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Rose went about her usual routine, her heart pounding every time she heard footsteps in the hallway. She had spent years being invisible to these people, but now she felt as though every eye was on her. Still, she kept cleaning, kept smiling, and kept watching. The response came faster than she expected. By afternoon, suits from the SEC had quietly entered the building, heading straight for the executive floor. Rose watched from behind her cleaning cart as they emerged from the elevator, their faces stern and purposeful. The same executives who had walked past her for years without a glance were now rushing around in barely concealed panic. Mr. Thompson's secretary was frantically shredding documents, not realizing that Rose had already documented everything. The CFO was seen hurrying through the back stairs with his laptop, sweat staining his expensive shirt. The tension in the office was thick enough to cut with a knife. During her evening shift, Rose overheard fragments of heated conversations through closed doors. How did they find out? Who talked? We need to contain this. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were looking for a whistleblower among the executives, never suspecting the quiet cleaning lady who had witnessed their misdeeds for years. That night, as Rose was emptying the trash in the Human Resources office, she found torn pieces of paper with lists of employees to be immediately terminated. Her name wasn't on them. They still didn't consider her important enough to be a threat. She carefully photographed the pieces with her phone, adding them to her growing collection of evidence. The next day, the company's stock price began to drop as rumors of an SEC investigation leaked to the press. Rose watched the chaos unfold from the shadows, continuing her work with the same careful attention she always had. She saw young interns crying at their desks, worried about their futures, and mid-level managers frantically updating their resumes. Mr. Thompson called an emergency board meeting. Rose made sure she was cleaning the adjacent conference room, her movements slow and deliberate as she listened through the thin walls. The CEO's voice was shrill with panic as he tried to blame everyone but himself for the company's situation. "We need to find who did this and make an example of them," he shouted, pounding his fist on the table. "No one betrays this company and gets away with it." What Mr. Thompson didn't realize was that his biggest mistake had been underestimating the very people he looked down upon. Rose had not only sent evidence to the SEC but had also been in contact with a group of employees who had faced discrimination and unfair treatment. Together, they had built a case that was impossible to ignore. As Rose finished her shift that evening, she received a call from the SEC investigator she had been working with. "Mrs. Washington," he said, "we're going to need you to come in tomorrow morning. And bring your documentation, all of it." She looked around the quiet office, at the desks she had dusted countless times, the floors she had mopped, and the windows she had cleaned while watching the sun rise over the city. Tomorrow, everything would change. The invisible woman was about to step into the light, and the power dynamics of Richardson and Associates were about to be turned upside down. Rose went home that night and hugged her daughter extra tight. Sometimes, she told her, the most powerful thing you can be is underestimated. She stayed up late reviewing her documents one final time, knowing that the next day would be one that no one at Richardson and Associates would ever forget. The next morning, Rose walked into the SEC's downtown office wearing her best dress, the one she saved for special occasions. Her daughter had helped her prepare, braiding her hair neatly and giving her a confident smile. "You've got this, Mom," she had said, and those words echoed in Rose's mind as she sat down with the investigators. For the next 4 hours, Rose laid out her evidence methodically. She explained complex financial maneuvers in simple terms, drawing from her business education and years of observational experience. The investigators were visibly impressed by her thorough documentation and clear understanding of corporate finance. "Mrs. Washington," the lead investigator said, leaning forward, "do you realize what you've uncovered here? This isn't just about cooking the books, this is systematic fraud on a massive scale." Meanwhile, back at Richardson and Associates, chaos had erupted. Federal agents had arrived with search warrants, boxing up computers and documents. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering anxiously as they watched their phones for news updates. The company's stock had plummeted by 30% in just 2 hours. Mr. Thompson was in full damage control mode, calling an all-hands meeting in the main conference room. Rose slipped in quietly, standing at the back with her cleaning cart. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile as she watched the CEO squirm under the fluorescent lights. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," he declared, his voice carrying a tremor despite his attempt at confidence. "Someone is trying to destroy everything we've built. But I assure you, we will find who's responsible and they will face consequences." As if on cue, 2 FBI agents entered the conference room. "Mr. Thompson," one announced firmly, "we need you to come with us." The room fell silent as they escorted the CEO out, his face ashen. Employees pulled out their phones, recording the moment their untouchable boss was led away in handcuffs. Rose continued pushing her cart through the corridors, observing the aftermath. The same executives who had previously ignored her were now jumping at every sound, paranoid about who might be watching them. She overheard the CFO in his office, frantically calling his lawyer. During her lunch break, Rose received an unexpected call from the board of directors. They wanted to meet with her immediately. As she walked into the boardroom, this time through the front door instead of the service entrance, she held her head high. The same people who had never bothered to learn her name were now staring at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Mrs. Washington," the board chairman began, clearing his throat uncomfortably, "we understand you have quite an impressive educational background. And it seems you've been observing our company's operations very carefully." Rose sat calmly, her hands folded on the table. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that several board members couldn't meet her gaze. She thought about all the times she had wiped coffee stains from this very table while these same people had treated her like she was invisible. "You know," she said quietly, "there's an advantage to being underestimated. People reveal their true nature when they think nobody's watching." She pulled out a fresh stack of documents from her bag, evidence she hadn't even shared with the SEC yet. "And I've seen quite a lot." The board members exchanged nervous glances. They were beginning to realize that the cleaning lady they had ignored for years was about to become the most powerful person in the room. And Rose Washington was just getting started. The news spread through Richardson and Associates like wildfire. Rose Washington, the cleaning lady who had exposed massive corporate fraud, was now sitting on the company's advisory board. The same elevator where she had once been told to take the service lift was now stopping at the executive floor to deliver her to emergency meetings. But not everyone was ready to accept this new reality. A group of senior managers, led by Vice President Richardson Jr., the founder's nephew, were doing everything they could to undermine her. They whispered in corners, spread rumors about her qualifications, and questioned her every move. Just because she caught some accounting mistakes doesn't make her qualified to help run this company, Richardson Jr. sneered during a management meeting, not realizing Rose was walking in behind him. "You're right," Rose replied calmly, making him jump. "What makes me qualified is my business degree, my finance degree, and 20 years of watching how this company really operates, from the ground up." She placed a thick folder on the table. "Now, shall we discuss the systematic wage theft in your department?" The room fell silent. Rose had spent years documenting not just the major fraud, but every instance of worker exploitation she had witnessed. She knew which managers took credit for their subordinates' work, which ones changed time cards to avoid paying overtime, and which ones had been promoting based on golf club memberships rather than merit. That afternoon, Rose walked through the maintenance department where she had worked for so long. Her former colleagues watched in amazement as she talked with SEC investigators, pointing out discrepancies in the payment systems and highlighting safety violations that had been ignored for years. "Mrs. Washington," called out Mrs. Chen, who had cleaned the building's windows for 15 years. "They're saying you're going to be on the board. Is it true?" Rose smiled warmly at her friend. "Better than that. I'm going to make sure every person in this building gets treated with the respect they deserve." She pulled out her phone and showed Mrs. Chen the new company-wide memo: immediate pay raises for all maintenance staff, full benefits, and educational assistance programs. But Rose's biggest move came later that week. During a board meeting, she presented evidence of how Richardson Jr. and his allies had been siphoning money from employee pension funds. The board members, already shaken by the CEO's arrest, watched in stunned silence as she laid out a detailed trail of financial misconduct. "We have two choices," Rose announced, standing at the head of the table where she had once cleaned coffee stains. Either these executives resign immediately, or this evidence goes to the SEC tomorrow morning. Richardson Jr. turned red with rage. You can't do this. Do you know who I am? This is my family's company. Rose didn't flinch. And do you know who I am? I'm the woman who cleaned your office every night while you stole from hardworking people's futures. The choice is yours: resign with some dignity, or leave in handcuffs like Mr. Thompson. By sunset, 5 senior executives had submitted their resignations. As Rose watched them pack their offices, she remembered all the times they had walked past her like she was invisible. Now, they couldn't look her in the eye as they carried their boxes to the elevator. That evening, as she walked through the office, employees stopped to shake her hand. The young janitor who had been humiliated by Mr. Thompson was now enrolled in the company's new education program, studying for his business degree. The maintenance staff walked with their heads held higher, no longer required to use separate entrances or break rooms. Rose paused at the window, looking out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter. "Mom, you're trending on social media. They're calling you the corporate cleaning lady who cleaned up Wall Street." She smiled, thinking about how life had changed. But her work was far from over. There was still so much to clean up at Richardson and Associates, and this time, she wasn't just pushing a mop. As Rose settled into her new role as Chief of Corporate Ethics and Employee Relations at Richardson and Associates, she discovered that changing a company's culture was harder than exposing its crimes. The old guard might have been removed, but their influence lingered in the company's DNA. One morning, she arrived to find her office door plastered with printouts of her old cleaning schedule. Instead of being intimidated, she gathered the papers and called an all-staff meeting. "Someone wanted to remind everyone of my past," she announced, holding up the schedules. "So let me remind you, I worked 2 jobs, raised a daughter alone, and earned 2 degrees while cleaning these offices. I'm not ashamed of my journey. The question is, are you proud of yours?" The attempted humiliation backfired spectacularly. By lunchtime, employees were sharing their own stories. A senior accountant revealed she'd worked as a waitress through college. A young executive admitted his parents had been janitors. The wave of authenticity swept through the company, breaking down the artificial barriers that had separated people for years. Rose's daughter visited the office that afternoon, bringing lunch to her mother. As they sat in what used to be the CEO's office, they could hear workers in the hallway discussing the company's new tuition reimbursement program. 3 maintenance staff members had already signed up for business classes. "You know what's funny, Mom?" her daughter said, looking around the luxurious office. "You spent years cleaning this room, and now it's yours. But you haven't changed a thing about it." Rose smiled, touching the familiar desk she'd dusted countless times. Sometimes the best way to change things is to remember exactly how they were. That afternoon, Rose faced her biggest challenge yet. The company's largest client, Big Tech Industries, was threatening to pull their contract unless certain traditional practices were reinstated, practices that had allowed them to underpay for services while overcharging their own customers. In the boardroom, several members argued for compromise. "We can't afford to lose them," one insisted. "The shareholders will revolt." Rose stood up, her voice firm but calm. "I cleaned Big Tech CEO's office when he visited last year. I saw the spreadsheets he left out. They're desperate for our services because no other company can match our quality. They're bluffing, and they're about to learn that the new Richardson and Associates doesn't bluff back." She pulled out her phone and dialed Big Tech CEO on speakerphone. "Mr. Harrison," she said clearly, "this is Rose Washington. I understand you have concerns about our new practices. Let me be clear, we're not returning to the old ways. But I'd be happy to show you how our ethical business model will actually increase your profits while improving worker conditions." The silence in the room was deafening. Board members held their breath, expecting disaster. Instead, they heard a chuckle from the speaker. "Mrs. Washington, I've been hearing about you. They say you're changing the game on Wall Street. Perhaps it's time we had a proper meeting, one where you're not cleaning my office." After the call, Rose walked through the office floors, stopping to chat with employees at all levels. She saw a young cleaning lady studying a business textbook during her break and sat down beside her. "The hard part isn't getting the degree," she advised, "it's believing you deserve it. And you do." That evening, as Rose packed up to leave, she found a gift on her desk, a framed photo of her first day as a cleaning lady at Richardson and Associates, taken 15 years ago. Attached was a note from Mrs. Chen: "You didn't just clean this company. You gave us all a chance to shine." Rose hung the photo prominently on her office wall, right next to her business degrees and her new corporate title. It would serve as a reminder to everyone who entered: success wasn't about where you started, but how you chose to finish. The media couldn't get enough of Rose Washington's story. Business magazines wanted interviews, TV shows sought exclusive rights, and social media was ablaze with her journey from cleaning lady to corporate reformer. But Rose had learned long ago that spotlight and substance were two different things. She declined most interviews, focusing instead on real change. When a major business network finally convinced her to appear on their morning show, she brought along Mrs. Chen and 2 other maintenance staff members who had enrolled in college programs. "This isn't about one person's success story," she told the host. "It's about creating opportunities for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." Back at Richardson and Associates, Rose's daughter had started an internship in the finance department, earning her position through merit rather than connections. Walking through the office together one morning, they overheard 2 executives complaining about the new profit-sharing program Rose had implemented. "Mom," her daughter whispered, "those men used to ignore you. Now they're afraid of you." Rose shook her head. "They're not afraid of me, honey. They're afraid of change. But they'll learn that doing the right thing is good for everyone, even them." That afternoon, Rose received an unexpected visitor, the wife of former CEO Thompson, who was now facing criminal charges. Mrs. Thompson sat nervously in Rose's office, clutching her designer handbag. "My husband lost everything," she said, her voice breaking. "We're selling our house, our cars. I need a job, but nobody will hire the wife of a disgraced CEO." Rose studied the woman who had once looked through her like she was invisible. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have any skills or education?" I have a teaching degree. I taught elementary school before I married Richard." Rose picked up her phone. "The company's new daycare center needs a director. The pay isn't what you're used to, but it's honest work. Would you be interested?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you help me? After everything?" "Because true change means breaking the cycle," Rose replied quietly. "And everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their story." Later that week, Rose faced a different kind of challenge. A group of investors offered to buy out Richardson and Associates, promising to make her incredibly wealthy. The catch? They wanted to roll back some of her reforms to maximize profitability. During the presentation, Rose noticed their assistant taking notes in the corner, being treated the same way she once was, invisible and insignificant. She thought about how many deals like this had been made in this very room, with no one considering the human cost. "Gentlemen," she interrupted their pitch, "let me tell you what real wealth is. It's walking through this building and seeing people who were once afraid to make eye contact now standing tall. It's watching former cleaning staff attend college classes after work. It's knowing that everyone here earns enough to support their families with dignity." She stood up, smoothing her dress. "Your offer is declined. And by the way," she turned to their assistant, "we're always hiring people who want to grow. Stop by HR if you're interested in a company that values everyone's potential." That evening, as Rose cleaned her own office, some habits die hard, she found an old photograph that had slipped behind a filing cabinet. It showed the executive team from 5 years ago, all standing proudly in their expensive suits. In the background, barely visible, was Rose with her cleaning cart. She pinned the photo next to her degrees and recent awards. "Remember where you came from," her father used to say, "but never let it define where you're going." Rose's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. "Mom, guess what? Mrs. Chen's daughter just got accepted to business school with our company scholarship." Looking out at the city lights, Rose smiled. The building she had once cleaned in the dark was now a beacon of hope for others. But her work wasn't finished, it was just beginning on a whole new level. 6 months into Rose's leadership, Richardson and Associates had become a case study in corporate transformation. Other companies were watching closely, some with admiration, others with concern. The old guard of Wall Street wasn't comfortable with a former cleaning lady proving that ethical business could be profitable. One morning, Rose received an urgent call from the board. A consortium of traditional investment firms was attempting a hostile takeover. They had been quietly buying shares, and now controlled nearly enough stock to force a vote on the company's direction. "They want to return to the old ways," a board member explained nervously. "They're saying our profit margins are too low, that our employee benefits are too generous." Rose sat at her desk, remembering all the late nights she'd spent cleaning this very room, listening to executives plot ways to squeeze more profit from their workers. Now she was facing the same battle, but from a different position. That afternoon, she called an emergency town hall meeting. Every employee, from executives to maintenance staff, packed into the company auditorium. Rose stood at the podium, her voice clear and strong. "Today, we face a choice," she began. "The Wall Street raiders want what they've always wanted, maximum profit at minimum cost. They say our way of doing business, where every employee has a chance to grow and earn a decent living, is too expensive." She paused, looking around the room. "But let me show you some numbers they don't want to discuss." Behind her, a screen displayed charts and graphs. "Since we implemented our new policies, employee turnover has dropped by 80%. Productivity is up 60%. Customer satisfaction has reached record highs. And yes, our profit margins are slightly lower, but our total profits are higher because we're doing better work with engaged employees." The room erupted in applause, but Rose held up her hand. "Here's what they really don't want you to know. Each of you owns shares in this company now through our employee stock program. Together, the employees of Richardson and Associates own 23% of the company. If we stand united, they cannot take control." Mrs. Chen stood up from her seat. "I may be just a window cleaner," she said, "but my daughter's in business school because of this company. I'm keeping my shares." One by one, employees stood up, pledging to hold their shares. The young janitor who was now taking night classes in finance raised his hand. "Mrs. Washington, I did some calculations. If we all pool our year-end bonuses, we could buy even more shares. They thought we were just workers, they didn't expect us to become owners." Rose smiled, feeling a surge of pride. The same people who had once been treated as disposable were now standing up as shareholders, defending their company's values. Later that evening, as she walked through the office, she saw employees gathered in small groups, explaining stock markets to each other, discussing business strategy. The cleaning staff was sitting in the break room, calculating share prices on their phones. The barriers between white-collar and blue-collar were dissolving. Her phone rang. It was a reporter asking for comment on the takeover attempt. "Tell them this," Rose said firmly. "The days of treating employees like machinery are over. We're not just cleaning up one company, we're showing the world that dignity and profit can go hand in hand." As she hung up, she noticed a small group of maintenance workers huddled around a computer, taking an online business course together after their shift. On the wall behind them hung the company's new motto, "Every person matters." Every job has dignity. Every voice counts. Rose touched the worn edge of her old cleaning badge, which she kept in her pocket as a reminder. The corporate raiders thought they were fighting for control of a company. What they didn't understand was that they were up against something much more powerful, people who had finally found their voice and weren't about to be silenced again. 1 year to the day after Rose Washington first sent that whistleblower email, Richardson and Associates held its annual shareholder meeting. But this time was different. Instead of being held in an exclusive country club, the meeting took place in the company's main auditorium, with every employee invited to attend. The attempted hostile takeover had failed spectacularly. When news broke about employees uniting to protect their company, small investors and ethical investment funds had rallied behind them. The Wall Street raiders hadn't just lost their bid for control, they'd sparked a movement. Rose stood at the podium, looking out at the packed auditorium. In the front row sat her daughter, now a rising star in the finance department. Next to her was Mrs. Chen, who had recently been promoted to facilities management supervisor while finishing her business degree. The young janitor who had once been humiliated by Mr. Thompson was now managing the company's education assistance program. 1 year ago, Rose began, I was pushing a cleaning cart through these halls. Today, I'm pushing for change across corporate America. But the real story isn't about me. It's about what happens when we recognize the dignity in every person and the potential in every position. She gestured to a large screen behind her, which displayed the company's annual results. Our profits are up 45% from last year. Employee satisfaction is at 94%. Our turnover rate is the lowest in the industry. And most importantly, over 80% of our maintenance and support staff are enrolled in education or training programs. From the audience, a familiar face stood up, Mrs. Thompson, the former CEO's wife, now running the company's highly successful childcare center. I used to think success meant having power over others, she said, her voice trembling. You showed me it means empowering others to succeed. Rose smiled, remembering their first awkward meeting. Success isn't about climbing over others to reach the top. It's about building elevators that can lift everyone up. The meeting took an unexpected turn when Rose announced the company's newest initiative, a foundation to help other corporations transition to ethical business models. Change doesn't have to start at the top, she explained. Sometimes the best view of what needs fixing comes from the ground floor. After the meeting, Rose walked through the office halls one last time that evening. She passed the janitor's closet where she had once hidden her business books, now converted into a small study room for employees taking online classes. The separate entrances for maintenance staff had been removed, replaced with a single entrance for everyone. In the break room, she found a group of executives and cleaning staff sharing dinner while discussing the company's new mentorship program. The artificial barriers of position and status had melted away, replaced by mutual respect and shared purpose. Her phone buzzed with news alerts. Other companies were facing pressure from their employees to adopt the Richardson model. What had started as one woman's stand against injustice had sparked a revolution in corporate culture. As Rose gathered her things to head home, she stopped by her old cleaning cart, still displayed proudly in the company lobby alongside photos of the company's history. A young intern was studying it intently. Mrs. Washington, the intern asked, do you ever miss those days? Rose touched the worn handle of the cart that had supported her through countless nights of invisible labor. I don't miss being invisible, she replied. But I'll never forget what I learned pushing this cart, that every job has value, every person has potential, and real change starts when we stop looking past people and start looking out for them. She stepped out into the evening air, remembering that night 1 year ago when she'd hit send on the email that changed everything. The city skyline sparkled before her, but now it wasn't just a view she cleaned windows to see, it was a horizon of possibilities she had helped create, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Mom, her daughter called from the car. Ready to go? The night school graduates want you to speak at their ceremony. Rose smiled, picking up her pace. There was still work to be done, changes to be made, and battles to be fought. But now she wasn't fighting alone, she had an army of believers behind her, proving that the most powerful cleaning up happens when people join together to wipe away the stains of inequality and polish the windows of opportunity until everyone can see their own reflection in them.